Hi
Great.
there.
Hi, thanks for talking to me. Appreciate it. Watched the movie yesterday. Very much enjoyed it. To start off, why don't you talk about how you got the idea for this? Because I know it came from the lake, but obviously the story is kind of not directly from that. I don't know. Maybe it is.
Yeah.
It's slightly when we got there and we were living off the lake, after having found a photo of it on Reddit, we were we were living off the lake and we got lost a lot. We were out there in these little dinghy kayaks, and when we went around with people who had lived off the lake their whole lives, they told us stories about how everybody gets lost. How sometimes they've actually found people who have been forced to stay out there overnight because they couldn't find their way home. And at the same time, it was the beginning of the pandemic. So we were talking a lot about death.
Yeah, my mom had passed away in 2019, and Celine had mentioned these conversations that she had had with her where my mom was telling her these memories from her life, and these were stories that I'd never heard before, like as her son. And it didn't even sound like my mom. And so it sort of prompted this question for us about like how well do you really know your parents? Because they've lived this life before you were even born, and can you ever understand that part of them? So we were swimming in all these ideas of family and chosen family and how much unknown there is actually to what are these very intimate relationships. And that was sort of coming up against our experience of this lake that was so vast and like impossible to understand in its own way too. And so I think that's how there was this marriage between the themes we wanted to explore in our story and this like iconic location.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how did it go from being the story idea to being a movie? Because obviously that's not usually an easy journey. So how did that happen?
I it was the pandemic I mentioned, and so we were like, what if we could shoot this thing totally outside, right? Like that was kind of like the original goal. So we wrote this story that was primarily, it was completely outside and had one protagonist, the girl Ellie, and we shared it with our producer, and she said, "This is horrible." So we went home and we got a whiteboard, and we had like this unlock where it could be two protagonists, and that was kind of when things started. We were cooking with gas, and things started feeling like they were actually coming together when we created the web of the actual film. Spoilers, when we landed on each time that we ended up in, and then what ending and who had to die. Anything you changed, other things fell. So the script came together quite easily when we shared it with Knight. He changed, the major twists were already there, but he felt like we had some things that were unfinished. For example, Ellie's mom, Celeste, never found out that Ellie was actually the other woman in that first version. And Knight was like, oh, she needs to tell her. And so we came up with the idea of her scratching her. And that's how she recognizes that this is the same girl from the parking lot. So there were things like that where, Knight would give us a note and we'd go home and we'd say, okay, in order to incorporate this in a way where we're not over explaining and using a lot of words, but we're really like trying to be embrace the visual medium of film as much as possible. So yeah, it's always a ride. It's definitely a ride. It took a second, and then into post, it was a whole nother exploration of figuring out how yeah, we could make sense of this when you weren't reading it but actually seeing it. But yeah, I think it hopefully it comes together enough for people to enjoy it.
From a storytelling point of view, though, did you ever worry about, I guess, getting people lost along the way? Because I know at least at the beginning, not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but at least at the beginning, you're kind of like, what, what? And then all of a sudden it comes
Yeah.
together. So, because I think the parking lot scene was kind of like the wow moment anyway.
Cool. Thanks.
For sure. Yeah, no, there's totally like a tax every time you're jumping between the storylines and sort of trying to satisfy and set up two protagonists as opposed to one within the same time frame though that you would normally just be trying to set up one character. That was probably the hardest challenge of the first act is trying to satisfy the genre elements and give people the texture of like, hey, this is the tone of the movie. Like this is the ride you're on, but we're also trying to show you who these two people are before we're off to the races. So I think probably the first act was the one that we had to craft the most in post and find, because like you said, once the sort of revelations start happening, you're kind of on a fast track to the end, which was always the goal of the story, ramping up to that. And yeah, there's trade-offs, I think to sort of like being on the pace and ride and feeling like the film is a cohesive whole, at the, expense of like living in these people's lives and getting to understand them. And hopefully we've like struck that right balance where you can be emotionally invested, but still understand that like the story is gonna explode.
But also, like, if you take out one of those scenes at the beginning, you will lose that satisfying thing at the end.
Yeah.
Like, you have to know, for example, keep talking about Ellie and her mom, that scene where she says that, it is kind of like there, but you need it for later. And you can't have it happen too early in the story. Otherwise, their relationship's so fractured that it doesn't quite make sense.
And pulling an Ellie scene or a Paris scene leaves you with two Paris scenes back to back. So there was like sort of even just a practical weight balance of making sure that one protagonist wasn't getting like unfair treatment compared to the other.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of sort of, yeah, like it was quite tricky. And that's not sort of the normal problems or, challenges you face within an edit of like this scene, this scene, this scene, this scene,
Next
where there's
movie,
a logical flow.
one protagonist.
One protagonist.
One protagonist.
Yeah, it's got a lot going on at once, a lot of moving pieces. So talk about the actual filming process. What were some of the difficulties? Because I would assume that filming it around the lake caused, some problems.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
a bit. There was like the magic of it in that like you're outside, so you're beholden to the elements. So, some of the bugs that are flying through the camera and the sweat and
The
the
sun,
mud
the
and
way
the
the sun
dirt.
came through the trees and
Like this is all, this is the reason you go out and shoot on location, like for all that stuff that you can't account for, that's just gonna like magically find its way onto film and you get to capture it. But we wore waders like half the time and we're boating around, getting dirty and having to be very calculated about the number of crew that could fit on a boat, what equipment we needed to take out for like the half-hour boat trip to get to this remote location. And there was a lot of logistical and safety concerns on, shooting on and off water like that, naturally so. And, to the credit of all of our boat captains and our stunt coordinator and everyone, like, there were no issues. But it was very taxing work, really not glamorous, it's a credit to our crew for that. Like they really had to like collectively be signed on to do this experience. And then to our cast, a lot of them who were asking to like, hey, like walk from A to B through this like swampland, 6 or 7 times as we like, perfectly try to capture this, is sort of wild what we asked of a lot of these people, but they really delivered.
Now you did, I think, 2 underwater scenes. Did you, I assume that was in a tank or did you actually film it? Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Tank, pieces of it were in the lake by the stunt double.
Yeah.
When the Paris boat, like where he actually falls into the water, and then his dead body on the water, things like that.
As soon as you go underneath the water of the lake,
Oh, and Dylan was in the water for the first scene when you go up to the bridge.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So it was mix and match, but we were in a tank for part of it.
As soon as you drop beneath, the lake water is actually just too murky to even see through.
Yeah.
There's so much dirt. So it's a bit of like, cinematic license to have a clear water tank water so you can actually see. And then a lot of that dirt is actually real time, real world elements that we cut in and brought in to help murky and dirty up the water to make it look like lake water.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I kind of wondered. I figured it would be dark underneath. So talk a bit about casting. How did the cast get involved in it?
So we had met Dylan and Eliza in actually generals, just like just random meetings before we wrote the script. So we kind of wrote the script for them, or like really thinking about them, and then sent it to them. And we were lucky enough that they were our first choices and they were down, which is awesome. The rest of the cast, we worked around them because people are related to each other. So we had to make sure that everyone felt like they belonged. Caroline Falk, who plays Anna, we had worked with on our short film, Caroline. So we felt like we really wanted to work with her again. And the rest of the cast, we had been fans of from afar. Lauren Ambrose, we worked with on Servant. So we were able to slip her the script pretty easily. And yeah, it definitely, we were casting up until the 11th hour.
Yeah.
My last question is, was there anything you feel like you couldn't do, I guess, because you did have some restrictions, especially if it was shot partially during COVID, that would have caused a lot of problems, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, we were just saying this earlier, honestly, how we feel like on an execution level, like our production team, our crew actually gave us everything we asked for as directors, which is, we obviously had to improvise and like pivot to shooting things a certain way because we would like lose locations because they just turned into mud baths, or because of certain types of weather, we'd have to like completely omit scenes or like just pivot in a lot of ways. But that happens, all the time. That's sort of like the beauty of filmmaking. In terms of something that like could not be accomplished, I'm not sure.
There's little things at the end of every day. We're like, oh my gosh, we didn't get that insert, but it was
Yeah.
okay in the end. We're like holding each other and driving back to the cabin. We're saying, we're like, oh my gosh, it's never gonna cut, but everything worked out.
There's certainly like, we love Caddo Lake so much and feel like it's this like eighth wonder of the world, honestly, that it's so bizarre that it's like in America and like a lot of people don't know about it, but we think it's this beautiful place. I think there was something really important to us about representing it, in the story and making sure that we did it justice in some way. And being aware of all the footage that is not in the film, that is glorious and beautiful in its own right, but just doesn't fit within the edit, you definitely have a lot of regrets of like, oh, like I really want to communicate the beauty of this place and how special it is, but it doesn't fit within the story. But the hope is that, like we said, the lake is its own character and that it does kind of resonate.
Yeah, definitely worked. One more thing I did think of, I wanted to ask, did you use real wolves, or was that like digital? I just thought about it all of a sudden.
Yeah.
No, we went to New Mexico and filmed real wolves.
Yeah.
And then we filmed those locations. We filmed the wolves in a lot of when you see them in 1952. Some of the wolves couldn't be with other wolves at the same time, so we were able to film the wolves in pairs or groups of 3, and then able to put them into that location. 1952 was a lot easier, but to have them walk on the water there was super shallow, and so we were actually going to bring a wolf to Caddo, but it ended up being too complicated. So yeah, it is VFX, but they are both real shots.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I really did enjoy the movie. Sorry, I know I went over 10 minutes, but I appreciate your time. I liked it a lot. I was very surprised until when we got to that point. So
Awesome.
I'm so glad.
Thanks so much for watching. So great meeting you.
You too. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.
Bye,
Bye.
Jamie.